The train hisses to a stop, a great sigh of steam clouding the raw timber platform of Redemption, Texas. For Elspeth Dunn, it is the sound of a closing cage door. She stands beside her single, worn valise, the fabric of her best gray wool dress seeming to shrink under the immense, white-hot sky. The man who sent for her, a Mr. Alastair Finch, is circling her like a vulture inspecting a carcass. He is a small man, made smaller by a suit too fine for the dust and a sneer that pinches his features. The photograph was misleading. Finch says, his voice a reedy instrument of disdain loud enough for the gathering crowd of dusty cowboys and bonneted townswomen to hear. It did not capture the scale of the situation. Elspeth's hands, broad and chapped from a life of labor, clench at her sides. Her face, already flushed from the oppressive heat, burns with a deeper, more painful fire. She is a tall woman, with shoulders made for hauling water and hips that speak of a sturdy, farm-fed lineage. In the advertisement, she had described herself as robust and capable. Mr. Finch, it seems, had a different interpretation. "You are too big," he declares, delivering the verdict like a judge. He waves a dismissive hand. "Entirely too big. A man of my standing requires a wife of delicacy, of refinement. Not a draft horse." A ripple of snickers moves through the onlookers. Elspeth feels each one like a physical blow. She stares at a crack in the sun-bleached platform boards, focusing on it with a desperate intensity, as if she can will herself to fall through it and disappear. She has $7 to her name and is 2,000 miles from the only home she has ever known, a home that no longer wanted her. Now, this new one doesn't want her either. The cage door hasn't just closed. It has vanished, leaving her in an open arena with nowhere to hide. From the edge of a small crowd, a man named Silas Blackwood watches. He leans against a support post for the general store's awning, his arms crossed over his chest. He came to town for salt licks and barbed wire, not for public spectacles. But he watches anyway. He sees the fine tremor in the woman's hands, the rigid set of her jaw, the way she holds her spine straight as a rod despite the humiliation raining down on her. He sees the strength in the column of her neck and the solid set of her feet on the platform. He looks at Finch with his polished shoes and his cruel, pinched mouth, and then he looks back at her. He sees past the shame coloring her cheeks to the sheer, unyielding resilience beneath. He sees a woman built not for a parlor, but for a life. A hard life. A life like his. And as Finch turns to walk away, leaving her utterly abandoned, a low, rumbling voice cuts through the titters of the crowd. She looks strong enough for Texas. Every head turns. Silas Blackwood pushes himself off the post, his movements unhurried. He doesn't look at Finch. His gaze is fixed on Elspeth. Strong enough for the work. Strong enough to survive what this land throws at you. He takes a step forward, his worn boots scuffing the dusty street. That's more important than delicacy. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The stakes are laid bare in the silence that follows. Elspeth is a ship without a harbor, a letter without an address. Her entire future, which had evaporated only moments before, now hangs on the words of this stranger, a tall, weathered man whose clothes are as practical as his pronouncement. He is assessing her not as a bride, but as a survivor. And for the first time since stepping off that train, a flicker of something other than shame stirs within her. Mr. Finch, incensed at being contradicted, spins around. "What business is it of yours, Blackwood? I am rejecting the delivery. The goods are damaged." Silas's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, finally shift to Finch. The look is flat, devoid of heat, yet makes the smaller man take an involuntary step back. "She ain't goods," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying with absolute authority. "She's a person, and you've just made a fool of yourself in front of the whole town for not knowing the difference." He turned his attention back to Elspeth, ignoring Finch as if he had ceased to exist. "Ma'am," he said, the the word a little rough from disuse. "My name is Silas Blackwood. I have a ranch a few hours west of here. It's hard country. I won't lie to you about that. But it's a place to be." And with that offer, a simple statement of fact, his life and hers were irrevocably changed. The wagon ride to the Blackwood Ranch was a study in silence. Elspeth sat on the hard buckboard seat, her valise tucked at her feet, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She did not dare look at the man beside her. She watched the landscape instead, a vast, brutal expanse of baked earth, thorny mesquite, and shimmering heat that seemed to go on forever. It was a world away from the green, rolling hills of her native Ohio. There, the land was gentle tamed. Here, it felt like an adversary, ancient and unconquered. It was intimidating, and yet a small, stubborn part of her felt a strange resonance with it. It was stark. It was honest in its harshness. Silas Blackwood handled the reins with an economy of motion that spoke of long familiarity. He was a man carved from the same material as the land itself, all sun-baked leather, hard angles, and quiet endurance. He hadn't said more than 5 sentences to her since they'd left town. After his public defense of her, he had simply loaded her valise onto his wagon, purchased the supplies on his list with a grim efficiency, and gestured for her to climb aboard. The townsfolk had stared, their whispers following them like burrs on a saddle blanket. She saw Mr. Finch watching from the window of the land office, his face a mask of sour fury. The scornful glances were a tangible weight, but Silas seemed not to notice or not to care. He moved through the town like a rock in a stream, unbothered by the current. Elspeth's own history was one of quiet resilience. The third of 5 daughters on a failing farm, she had been a capable, tireless worker since she was old enough to walk. But with her parents gone and the farm sold off to settle debts, she and her sisters were scattered. The mail-order bride advertisement had been a desperate gamble, a sliver of hope for a life of her own, a home. She had used her small inheritance to pay for the train ticket and a new dress. Believing in the promise of a man who wanted a capable partner, the public humiliation had shattered that hope into 1,000 pieces. Now a new, fragile hope was trying to knit itself together. This man, Silas Blackwood, had not spoken of her appearance again. He had not offered pity. He had offered a place. It was the most practical and, therefore, the most profound kindness she had received in years. Still, fear was a cold knot in her stomach. What did he expect of her? What kind of arrangement was this? The questions circled in her mind, too frightening to ask. As the sun began to dip low, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, a small cabin materialized in the distance. It was a simple, sturdy structure of dark, weathered wood, with a stone chimney and a wide, covered porch. A lone corral stood beside it, and beyond that, nothing but the endless, rolling plains. It was the most isolated place she had ever seen. Loneliness radiated from it, a palpable force. Silas brought the wagon to a halt near the porch. "We're here," he said. The mules stamped and blew, their harnesses jingling in the sudden quiet. He climbed down, his movements stiff from the long ride. He didn't look at her, but addressed the air in front of him. The house has 2 rooms, the main room and a small bedroom. "The bedroom is yours," he paused, then added, "There's a lock on the inside." Elspeth's head snapped up. She looked at him, then truly looked at him. His face was in shadow, his hat pulled low, but the meaning of his words was unmistakable. He was giving her privacy. He was assuring her of her safety. The knot of fear in her stomach loosened just a fraction. She managed a small, jerky nod, unable to find her voice. He unloaded her valise and set on the porch. "There's a pump out back for water. Stew from last night is on the stove. Help yourself with that." He turned and walked toward the corral to unhitch the mules, leaving her standing alone in the deepening twilight. She stepped into the cabin. It was spare, clean, and intensely masculine. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the main room. A shelf held a few tin plates and cups. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee. It was the scent of solitude. She pushed open the door to the bedroom. It contained a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wooden crate for a nightstand, and a single window looking out over the vast, empty land. It was more than she'd had a right to expect a few hours ago. She ran a hand over the lock on the door, a simple, sturdy bolt, a small, silent promise of security. Later, after she had washed her face and hands with cool water from the pump and eaten a bowl of the hearty, savory stew, she sat at the table while Silas cleaned his rifle. The silence between them was thick, but it was no longer the strained silence of the wagon ride. It was a different kind, a quiet that seemed to be waiting. Finally, he set the rifle aside and looked at her, his gaze direct. "Miss Dunn," he began, his voice a low rumble. "I want to be clear about this. I spoke up today because what that man did was wrong. No person should be treated like that." He leaned forward, his work-worn hands resting on the table. "I need help on this ranch. It's too much for one man, and I can't afford to hire a hand. You look like you're no stranger to work." She met his gaze, finding only stark honesty there. "I'm not," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Good," he nodded. "So here's the arrangement I propose. You can work here. You'll earn your keep, and I'll treat you fair. When I have enough cash saved, might be a while, I'll pay for your passage back east if that's what you want. Or you can stay on as a hired hand of sorts. The choice will be yours," he paused. "This is a business arrangement. Nothing more. You'll have your room, your privacy. I'll expect a hard day's work. And in return, you'll have a roof over your head and food on the table. Is that acceptable?" He was giving her agency. He was laying out terms, not demands. He was treating her like a partner in a contract, not a piece of property he'd impulsively acquired. It was more respect than Mr. Finch had shown her in his letters, more than anyone had shown her in a very long time. "It's more than acceptable, Mr. Blackwood," Elspeth said, and for the first time that day, her back straightened not with defiance, but with a burgeoning sense of purpose. "It's generous." He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "We start at sunrise. The chickens need tending, and there's a fence down by the south pasture." He stood up, towering over her in the small room. "Get some rest. You've earned it." He moved toward the corner of the main room, where a simple cot was set up, a place she hadn't even noticed before. He was giving her the only proper bed. The gesture was as plain and solid as the man himself. Elspeth retreated to her room and slid the bolt home. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window at the sea of stars, brighter and clearer than any she had ever seen. The land was still terrifying, the future still uncertain. But for now, she had a place. She had work to do, and that, she knew, was a form of salvation. She would prove him right. She would be strong enough for Texas. The next morning, Elspeth was up before the first hint of dawn, the ingrained habits of a lifetime overriding the exhaustion in her bones. She found Silas already by the stove, a pot of coffee brewing. He glanced at her, a flicker of something, surprise, approval, in his eyes, and gestured toward the pot with a nod. They drank the strong, black coffee in silence as the sky outside softened from indigo to a pale, dusty rose. The work was relentless. It was harder than any she had ever known. The sun was a physical weight, the earth was hard as iron, and every plant seemed to have thorns. But Elspeth was not afraid of work. She mucked out the small chicken coop with a practiced efficiency that made Silas pause and watch for a moment. She collected the eggs with gentle hands. When he led her to the broken fence line, he handed her a pair of thick leather gloves. "Watch for snakes," was all he said. He showed her how to stretch the wire taut, how to hammer in the staples with clean, powerful strokes. She watched, then took the hammer from him. Her first few swings were clumsy, but she quickly found the rhythm. Her arms, which Mr. Finch had scorned, were strong. Her hands, which had never known idleness, were capable. They worked side by side for hours under the climbing sun, the only sounds the clang of the hammer, the creak of leather, and the whisper of the hot wind. During a brief rest in the sliver of shade cast by the wagon, Silas passed her a canteen. "You're a quick study," he remarked. It was not a compliment so much as a statement of fact, which made it mean more to her. My father always said I had a good eye for a straight line, she replied, the memory bringing a surprising pang of homesickness. He just grunted, but it was not an unkind sound. He was a man who communicated in grunts and nods, in small, practical actions. Words were a currency he spent sparingly. She was beginning to learn the language of his silences. In the days that followed, a routine settled over them, as stark and dependable as the rising and setting of the sun. They worked from dawn until dusk, falling into their respective beds bone-weary and soul-tired. Elspeth took over the domestic chores without being asked, finding a quiet satisfaction in bringing a small measure of order to the bachelor's cabin. She scrubbed the floors, washed their tin plates until they shone, and discovered a knack for making biscuits that were light and fluffy, a stark contrast to Silas's hard, unleavened lumps. One evening, he came in from the corral to find the cabin filled with the smell of baking bread and a wild berry crumble she'd made from bushes she found near the creek. He stopped in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He looked at the table, then at her, her face flushed from the heat of the fire. He said nothing, but when he ate 2 large helpings of the crumble, and she saw him close his eyes for a brief moment at the first bite. It was a more eloquent compliment than a flowery speech. Slowly, she began to leave her own mark on the place. She found a small patch of earth near the cabin that got morning sun and started a small garden, using seeds she'd carefully packed in her valise. She turned the hard soil, her hands aching, and planted rows of beans, squash, and hardy greens. Silas watched her from a distance, saying nothing, but the next day, a length of chicken wire appeared by the patch of tilled earth. For fence, to keep out the rabbits. Their discoveries about each other were small, unearthed like arrowheads in a freshly plowed field. He learned she could read when he found her one evening poring over the one book she'd brought with her, a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. It seemed a strange, delicate thing to find in this harsh world, and in the hands of this capable woman. "You read?" he'd asked, his surprise evident. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married," Elspeth had answered simply, not looking up from the page. She believed a mind needed tending as much as a garden. He just nodded and returned to oiling a piece of tack, but the silence that followed felt different, fuller. She, in turn, learned about his past one rainy afternoon when she was tidying the main room. Tucked away on a high shelf was a small, tin-type photograph in a simple wooden frame. It was of a young woman with a gentle smile and kind eyes, standing beside a much younger, smiling Silas. A Silas without the deep lines etched around his eyes, without the permanent shadow of sorrow. When he came inside, soaked from the rain, he saw her looking at the photograph. His face closed off, the familiar mask of stoicism falling into place. "My wife," he said, his voice flat. "Mary, she's beautiful," Elspeth whispered, placing the frame carefully back on the shelf. "Fever took her 3 years ago. Took our boy, too. He was only 6 inch," he said it without emotion, like he was reciting fact from an almanac. But his hands, as he hung his wet coat on a peg, were clenched into fists. The revelation settled between them, explaining so much: his solitude, his quiet grief, the profound loneliness that clung to the ranch like dust. It was a shared, unspoken secret now. She understood that he had not just lost a wife. He had lost his whole world, and he had chosen to retreat from the rest of it, into this fortress of work and silence. Their partnership solidified over shared hardships. A coyote snatched a chicken, and Silas taught her how to handle the heavy rifle, his large hands guiding hers to show her the proper grip, his breath warm against her ear. She was startled by their proximity, by the unexpected gentleness in his touch. He, in turn, seemed to flinch away as soon as he realized it, retreating back into a shell of gruff practicality. One afternoon, a calf got itself stuck in a muddy creek bed, its mother bawling pitifully nearby. It was too heavy for Silas to pull out alone from the slippery bank. Without hesitation, Elspeth waded into the thick, sucking mud, her skirt be damned. Together, shoulder to shoulder, straining and grunting, they managed to heave the terrified animal onto solid ground. They stood there afterwards, covered in mud, breathless and exhausted, and looked at each other. A small, genuine smile touched Silas's lips, and Elspeth felt her own face break into a grin. It was a moment of pure, unadorned victory, a shared triumph against the unforgiving land. The laughter that followed was rusty and brief, but it was real. The fragile peace they had built, however, was a world away from the town of Redemption. When it had to ride in for supplies a month later, the reality of their situation came crashing back down on them. The whispers followed them down the main street. The women pulled their children closer as they passed. The men at the saloon stopped talking and just stared. It was a cold, silent judgment that was more unnerving than open hostility. As Silas was loading sacks of flour onto the wagon, Mr. Alastair Finch stepped out of the mercantile, a smug, proprietary look on his face. He ignored Silas completely and addressed Elspeth, his eyes roaming over her work-roughened hands and plain, dusty dress. Well, he sneered, his voice carrying. Playing house with the hermit, are we? I must say, farm labor seems to suit your proportions. Elspeth froze, the old, familiar shame washing over her. She felt the eyes of the entire town on her. But before she could even think of a reply, Silas was there. He didn't raise his voice. He simply moved to stand between her and Finch, his body a solid wall. "You've got business with me, Finch. You talk to me," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "Leave her out of it." "I have no business with you, Blackwood," Finch scoffed. "I'm merely observing the local fauna. It's a pity. I had a contract. She was meant to be my wife. A legal agreement. You broke that contract on the platform for everyone to see," Silas countered, his calm more menacing than any shout. "You've got no claim. Now walk away." Finch's eyes narrowed with malice. A man can't be sure what goes on out there in the wilderness. An unmarried man and a vulnerable woman. The law might take an interest. The church, certainly, he smiled, a thin, cruel slash. For her own protection, of course. It was a clear threat, a poison dart aimed at the heart of their quiet life. He wasn't just trying to shame them. He was trying to use society as a weapon to destroy the sanctuary they had built. Silas's hand twitched, as if fighting the urge to reach for the man, but he held himself in check. He simply stared Finch down until the smaller man, flustered by the unblinking intensity, finally spun on his heel and stalked away. The ride home was silent again, but this time it was a heavy, troubled silence. Finch's words hung in the air between them. An unmarried man and a vulnerable woman. He had given their arrangement a dirty name, and the stain of it felt impossible to wash away. Elspeth stared at her hands, the strength in them suddenly feeling like a mark of shame again. Silas stared at the horizon, his jaw set like granite. The fragile bubble of their world had been pierced, and the judgment of the outside world was seeping in. That night, Elspeth lay awake in her bed, the bolt on her door for the first time feeling flimsy and useless. It could not protect her from rumors. It could not protect Silas from the trouble she had brought to his door. He had defended her, stood for her, and his only reward was to be sullied by the same gossip that had targeted her. The thought was unbearable. For the first time, the idea of being sent away felt less like a failure and more like a necessary sacrifice to protect him. A few weeks passed in a state of tense quiet. They worked harder than ever, as if by sheer force of will they could build a wall against the coming trouble. The corn in Elspeth's garden grew tall, and the days grew hotter. The bond between them deepened in the crucible of their shared anxiety. A shared look over the dinner table, a moment where his hand brushed hers as he passed her a tool. These small things were charged with an unspoken meaning. He was becoming her anchor, her home. She was becoming his purpose, the reason he was fighting against the solitude he had once embraced. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a roof. They were a unit, forged in labor and mutual respect. The trouble, when it came, did not ride in with the bluster of Alastair Finch. It came in the form of a black buggy, driven by the town preacher, Reverend Miller. He was a stern man with a face that looked like it had been carved from a sour apple. He was not alone. The sheriff, a weary-looking man named Hayes, rode alongside him. They arrived late one afternoon, their presence an official intrusion on the ranch's isolation. Silas met them on the porch, his stance wide and defensive. Elspeth watched from the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Blackwood," the preacher said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Sheriff Hayes and I have come on a matter of moral concern." "There's no concern here, Reverend," Silas said flatly. "That's not what the town is saying," Miller countered, his eyes flicking past Silas to Elspeth. "There are rumors. Ugly ones. Mr. Finch has lodged a formal complaint, expressing his fear for this young woman's virtue and safety." "Finch is a liar and a coward," Silas growled. "Be that as it may," Sheriff Hayes interrupted, his tone more tired than accusatory. "The situation is irregular, Silas. You know that. A young, unmarried woman living in your home. It's not right. It gives people reason to talk." "People will talk regardless," Silas shot back. "They talked when Mary died. They'll talk when the sun comes up tomorrow. It's what they do." "This is different," the preacher insisted. He looked directly at Elspeth. "Young woman, has this man harmed you? Are you here of your own free will?" All eyes turned to her. This was her moment. The shame, the fear, the humiliation from the train platform, it all swirled inside her. She could shrink. She could let them take her away and protect her, leaving Silas to his grief and his solitude. Or she could stand. She thought of his quiet acts of kindness, the gloves, the chicken wire, the cot in the main room. She thought of him standing between her and Finch, a solid, unmovable wall. She thought of the respect he had shown her from the very first moment. Elspeth stepped out onto the porch, moving to stand beside Silas. She lifted her chin and met the preacher's gaze, her own clear and steady. "My name is Elspeth Dunn, Reverend," she said, her voice stronger than she expected it to be. "I am here because Mr. Blackwood offered me honest work and a safe home when another man abandoned me to public ridicule." She took a breath, feeling Silas shift slightly beside her, a silent signal of support. "He has shown me nothing but respect and kindness. He's a good man, a better man than those who whisper lies about him in town." She looked from the preacher to the sheriff. "I'm here of my own free will. This is my home, and I will not be protected from the only decency I have known in this land." The silence that followed was absolute. The preacher looked taken aback, his prepared speech rendered useless. Sheriff Hayes rubbed his jaw, a thoughtful expression on his face. He looked at Silas, then at Elspeth, standing shoulder to shoulder, a united front. They were not a predator and his victim. They were partners. "Well," the sheriff said finally, breaking the tension. "She seems to have made her position clear." But Reverend Miller was not so easily deterred. "The position is still untenable in the eyes of God and the community," he said stiffly. "It invites sin and scandal. If your intentions are honorable, Blackwood, there's only one way to prove it. You must legitimize this arrangement." He let the words hang in the air. "Marry the girl, or the church and the law will have no choice but to intervene. I'll give you until Sunday to make your decision." With that ultimatum delivered, they turned their buggy and horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and turmoil in their wake. Sunday. They had 4 days. The sun began to set, bleeding color across the sky, but neither Silas nor Elspeth seemed to notice. The preacher's words echoed between them. Marry the girl. It was an absurd, impossible proposition, a marriage born of gossip and ultimatums. "I'm sorry," Elspeth whispered into the twilight, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I brought this on you. I should leave. I'll go in the morning." "And go where?" Silas asked, his voice rough. "Back to town? To Finch and the preacher? To be sent to a poorhouse or shipped back east like unwanted baggage?" "No," he turned to face her, his expression fierce in the dying light. "That's not happening. But a marriage, we can't. I won't have them run you off," he said, cutting her off. "I won't have him when—" He took a step closer, his hands still clenched at his sides. For a long moment, he just looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a maelstrom of emotions. Anger at Finch, grief for his past, and something else, something new and terrifying and powerful. It was protectiveness. It was a deep, possessive care that went far beyond their business arrangement. "Elspeth," he said, and the sound of her first name on his lips was both a shock and a comfort. "I know what they're asking is, it's not right. It's not what a marriage should be," he struggled with the words, a man unaccustomed to speaking from the heart. "But Mary, she's been gone a long time. This house, it's been empty, just a place to sleep. Since you've been here," he trailed off, shaking his head as if frustrated with his own inability to express himself. "You brought this place back to life. You brought me back to life." The confession hung in the air, more stunning than the preacher's ultimatum. He took a deep breath. "I'm asking you to consider it. A marriage of convenience. On paper, to shut them up, to give you my name, my protection. Nothing would have to change between us. Not unless you wanted it to." He finally looked at her, his gaze raw and vulnerable. "I don't want you to go, Elspeth. This ranch, it needs you. I need you." Tears finally spilled over and tracked paths through the dust on her cheeks. He wasn't talking about her strength anymore, not the strength in her arms or her back. He was talking about the strength of her spirit, the life she had breathed back into his desolate world. He saw her, all of her, and he wanted her to stay. In that moment, she knew her answer. This isolated ranch was more of a home than any place she had ever been. This quiet, grieving man was more of a partner than she had ever dared to hope for. "Yes," she said, her voice a whisper. "Yes, Silas, I'll marry you." They stood on the porch as full darkness fell, the decision settling around them not as a defeat, but as a pact, a quiet, resolute declaration of war against the judgment of the world. They would go to town on Sunday, and they would face it together. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the Texas sky a vast, indifferent blue. Elspeth wore her gray wool dress, the same one she had arrived in, but it felt different now. She had mended a small tear in the seam and pressed it carefully with a sad iron heated on the stove. It was the dress of a survivor, not a victim. Silas wore a clean shirt and the same determined, stoic expression he wore when facing a storm or a drought. The ride to town was a silent procession, but it was a silence of shared purpose. When they arrived, the main street was unnervingly quiet, yet faces peered from behind curtains in every window. The news of the preacher's ultimatum had spread like wildfire. Their destination was the small, clapboard church at the end of the street, and it seemed the entire population of Redemption was gathered on the lawn in front of it, waiting for the spectacle. At the forefront of the crowd, standing beside Reverend Miller, was Alistair Finch. He looked triumphant, a smug smirk plastered on his face. He believed he had won, that he had forced them into a corner, exposing their arrangement for the sham he proclaimed it to be. As Silas helped Elspeth down from the wagon, a hush fell over the onlookers. Every eye was on them. Elspeth felt a tremor of the old fear, the familiar shame of being judged and found wanting. Her hand instinctively went to her arm, a gesture of self-protection. Then, she felt Silas's hand, warm and solid, cover hers. He didn't squeeze it or pat it. He just held it, a simple, grounding touch that said, "I am here. We are together." She drew strength from it, straightened her spine, and lifted her chin. They walked toward the church steps, a silent, unified pair moving through a sea of staring faces. Reverend Miller looked down at them from the top step, his face a granite mask of piety. Silas Blackwood, the preacher intoned, his voice booming in the quiet. "Have you come to a decision in accordance with God's law and the decency of this community?" "We have," Reverend Silas said, his voice calm and steady, carrying easily over the crowd. He did not let go of Elspeth's hand. "Miss Dunn has agreed to be my wife." A murmur went through the crowd. Finch's smirk widened. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the public humiliation, the forced, pathetic union. He stepped forward, his reedy voice dripping with false concern. "Reverend, surely you must question this. This is a mockery of the holy sacrament of marriage, a desperate act to cover their sin. Look at them, a broken-down hermit and a woman so substantial that no respectable man would have her. He's not marrying her for love. He's taking her on as a beast of burden because he's too poor to hire a proper hand. The insult was brutal, designed to strip away their last shred of dignity. Elspeth flinched, the word substantial a poisoned dart to her heart. She felt the blood drain from her face. The crowd tittered, their judgment sharp and merciless. But Silas did not get angry. He did not shout. He simply turned his head and looked directly at Finch. His stormy eyes filled not with rage, but with a deep, profound pity that was more insulting than any anger could be. He let go of Elspeth's hand and took a half-step in front of her, shielding her. "You're right about one thing, Finch," Silas said, his voice quiet but resonant, compelling everyone to lean in and listen. "I'm not marrying her for the reasons you think." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing back on Finch. "When I first saw her on that train platform you left her on, you called her too big. I looked at her, and I saw something else. I saw strength." He turned slightly, his eyes finding Elspeth's. And in that moment, he was not speaking to the crowd anymore. He was speaking only to her. "I saw a woman with hands that knew how to work, how to heal, how to create. I saw shoulders strong enough to carry not just buckets of water, but burdens too. I saw a spine that wouldn't break, no matter how much shame you try to pile on it." His voice grew stronger, filled with a conviction that silenced every whisper. "You say I'm taking on a beast of burden. I say I'm gaining a partner. In the weeks she's been at my ranch, that woman has brought more life to that land than I've seen in 3 years. She grew a garden out of dust and rock. She saved a calf that I couldn't save alone. She turned a silent, empty house into a home. She did it with the same strength you find so disgusting." He took a step toward Finch, who involuntarily shrank back. "You talk about her size. Let me tell you about her size. Her heart is big enough to show kindness to a grieving man. Her spirit is big enough to fill the loneliest corners of this land. Her courage is bigger than this whole town's small-minded prejudice." He stopped, standing tall and resolute. He turned back to Elspeth, and the love and fierce pride in his eyes were so potent, so real, that they were a physical force in the air. He held out his hand to her. "You called her too big, Finch," Silas declared, his voice ringing with absolute truth. "I call her strong enough for Texas. I call her more than enough for me. And I'm the luckiest man in this state, if she'll have me." Tears were streaming freely down Elspeth's face, but they were not tears of shame. They were tears of overwhelming, world-altering gratitude. She had never been so fiercely defended, so deeply seen. She placed her hand in his, her grip firm and sure. She then found her own voice, and it was clear and unwavering as she looked past Silas to the stunned faces of the preacher and the crowd. "I choose this man," she said. "I choose this life. With my whole heart." The spectacle Finch had engineered had backfired completely. He stood there, his mouth agape, his cruelty exposed and shriveled under the light of Silas's powerful words. He had been made to look petty, weak, and utterly blind. Some people in the crowd looked down at their feet, ashamed. The blacksmith's wife, a woman as sturdy as Elspeth herself, gave a firm, decisive nod of approval. The moral high ground had shifted decisively. Silas and Elspeth turned their backs on Finch and the gawking crowd. They faced Reverend Miller, their hands still clasped, their two solitary figures now an unbreakable unit. Reverend Silas said, "We're ready." The preacher, looking flustered but cornered by the undeniable sincerity of the moment, cleared his throat and opened his book. The vows they exchanged were the simple, traditional words, but for Silas and Elspeth, they were imbued with the weight of every hardship they had faced, every silent understanding, every shared victory. This was no longer a marriage of convenience. It was a covenant forged in public defiance, sealed with mutual, hard-won reverence. It was the truest thing in that entire town. The wagon ride back to the ranch was different. The silence that settled between them was not one of awkwardness or anxiety, but of deep, resonant peace. The vast landscape no longer seemed intimidating. It looked like home, welcoming them back. Halfway there, Elspeth felt Silas's calloused fingers gently entwine with her own on the buckboard seat. She looked at their joined hands, his, large and weathered, hers, broad and capable. A perfect fit. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, and when she glanced at him, she saw it was mirrored on his. Back at the cabin, the setting sun cast long shadows from the porch posts. The place felt the same, yet entirely transformed. It was no longer his house where she was staying. It was their home. That evening, as she stood by the stove, stirring a pot of stew, Silas came up behind her. She tensed for a moment, the newness of their relationship still a fragile thing. He didn't speak. He just gently placed his hands on her shoulders, on the very shoulders Mr. Finch had scorned. They were not the hands of a man claiming property, but the hands of a partner offering comfort, sharing a burden. She leaned back into his touch, a silent acknowledgement of all that had passed between them and all that was to come. The memory of the train station, of the sneers and the humiliation, was now just a story, the story of how she had come home. She was no longer Elspeth Dunn, the rejected mail-order bride. She was Elspeth Blackwood, a woman of substance, a woman of strength, a woman who was, and always had been, more than enough. Silas rested his chin on the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair and the wood smoke from the stove. He looked around the small, warm cabin, at the woman who now filled its heart, and he knew with a certainty that shook him to his core that he hadn't just stood up for a stranger that day in town. He had found the missing half of his soul. In defending her worth, he had rediscovered his own. The land was still hard. The future would still hold its struggles. But for the first time in a long time, Silas Blackwood was not afraid. He was home, and he was not alone. She is strong, and he is honored. Their journey forward is one of mutual respect, a partnership built on seeing the true value in each other when the world saw none. The quiet ranch is no longer a place of solitude, but a sanctuary for a love as resilient and powerful as the land itself. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.